Raise your right hand. Do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully testify in connection with this cause?
I do.
Please take a seat. And remove your mask, please. State your full name and spell it.
It's Tony Lee Gruenig, TonyLeegruenig.
Okay, officer, a couple things to keep in mind when you're testifying. The court reporter, as you remember, is taking down everything that's being said. Yes or no, instead of shaking your head, no or uh-uhs. If you don't understand a question, let the lawyer know. If an objection is made, stop talking. Don't answer the question unless I tell you to. And only one person can talk at a time, so wait until the attorney finishes his question before you answer.
I understand.
Okay. Counsel?
Could you state your occupation for the record?
A police officer with the City of Brooklyn Center.
How long have you been a police officer for Brooklyn Center?
19 years.
Starting in 2002?
Yes, sir.
Did you have a law enforcement experience prior to that?
Yes, I worked in South Dakota at a sheriff's office for about 6 years.
Now, could you go back to the beginning of your career from Brooklyn Center, in Brooklyn Center, and explain your role in rank and how it's changed over the years?
Sure. I started as a police officer in 2002. Spent about 3 years on patrol. I was promoted or moved into a drug task force position, and then a violent offender task force position, and then was promoted to a sergeant, and then promoted to a commander. Spent about 11 or so years as a commander. Within that role, I rotated through the 3 divisions. The division commanders report to the chief of police. I started in patrol, was moved to investigations, and then to community services, and then most recently I was back in patrol.
Your current rank is acting chief of the department, correct?
Correct.
And how long have you been in that role?
Since April 12th or 13th, somewhere in there.
Of this year?
Of this year, yes.
And you're a licensed peace officer?
I am.
And you take continuing education courses to maintain that license, correct?
I do.
I'd like to discuss Brooklyn Center and the Brooklyn Center Police Department generally as it existed on April 11th of 2021. What's the population of Brooklyn Center?
That's around 30,000 people.
Where is it located?
It's a first-ring suburb of North Minneapolis or Minneapolis.
Okay. And that's in Hennepin County, correct?
It is.
And how many licensed peace officers, when fully staffed, does the Brooklyn Center Police Department have?
Fully staffed is 49 police officers.
And out of those, how many sergeants are there?
There is 7 sergeants.
And how many commanders are there?
3.
And then there's just one chief, right?
Correct.
In this case so far, the jury has heard about the role of a patrol officer and the role of a patrol sergeant. Could you explain your duties as a commander as of April 2021?
Sure. It's largely administrative, so report to work every day to a desk. But for the most part, take administrative duties, which could range from working on ordering patrol cars or answering emails, but largely administrative. We answer to the chief of police, and I have as a patrol commander, I'd have 6 sergeants that would report to me.
Yep. So I appreciate your modesty, but basically you supervise officers and sergeants, correct?
Correct.
And you said you have a desk job. Do you have essentially regular work hours, weekday
Correct.
hours?
Correct. Salaried employee, regular work hours, weekdays.
Okay. And what you describe as paperwork, but it's paperwork related to policing, correct?
Correct.
So I'd like to know about your duties when there's a report that an officer uses force. Can you describe the process that you follow?
So an officer will use force. A street supervisor would try to report to the scene when force is used. The officer then would fill out a use of force sheet that is reviewed by the sergeant, and then the sergeant signs off on the use of force sheet if it's appropriate force, forwards it to the divisional commander who is in charge of that sergeant. Generally it's the patrol commander. The patrol commander reviews the use of force sheet and then submits it for filing.
Yep. And takes any necessary action, correct?
Correct.
I want to go one step farther from that. In addition to the protocols for responding to just use of force incidents, are there separate protocols for situations which would involve an officer involved shooting or in custody death.
Yes, a critical incident.
Yes.
Yeah,
And are you familiar with those policies?
I am.
Do those policies also place upon you as a supervising officer additional responsibilities?
Yes.
Now, we can talk about those responsibilities in a minute. I now just want to get a big picture. In a scene response, in terms of scene response and who conducts any subsequent investigation, are these officer-involved cases handled differently than typical cases?
Yes.
How?
So in critical incidents, right, you're talking about?
Yes.
So we would just do our agency, Brooklyn Center, if it was our incident, would just do a cursory investigation, maintain the scene, maintain the perimeter, the evidence, and turn it over to another agency.
Okay. And by turn it over, you mean turn any subsequent investigation over?
The entire, yes, the investigation.
The entire investigation?
Yes.
And why in a critical incident do you turn the investigation over to a different agency?
For conflict reasons and for transparency, so that we can allow another agency to investigate the incident.
So you don't be seen as investigating yourself?
Correct.
Or drawing conclusions about critical incidents yourself?
Correct.
As of April of 2021, is there a specific agency that typically assumed the role of investigation, should there be one in Brooklyn Center?
Yes, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or BCA.
Okay. And in a typical case, how is the decision made to essentially outsource the investigation?
The chief of police makes that decision.
If the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and I'm going to refer to it as the BCA, if the BCA is assigned to investigate a case, does the Brooklyn Center Police Department have any role, at least at the outset?
To basically give them the information that they need to investigate the crime, a thumbnail overview of what's going on, and then handing the case over to them. So very little to answer your question more directly.
Okay. What about if an event is acute, if it just occurred, are there other roles or other actions that Brooklyn Center Police may need to take, knowing that the BCA is ultimately going to be taking over the investigation?
Preserving the evidence on the crime scene would be the other acute one.
Yeah. And what may preserving evidence in the crime scene entail? What might it include?
Maintaining a perimeter, maintaining integrity of the evidence and the chain of custody from our agency, turning it over to another agency.
Okay. And when the investigation is turned over to another agency, does that occasionally take some time for that other agency to arrive on scene?
Yes, they are generally not a 24/7 agency.
And so if there is an event that occurs, is it common for you to take into consideration that the investigative agency may not arrive for some period of time, including hours?
Correct.
And so you know that those efforts to maintain scene integrity may also last hours.
Correct.
When the BCA arrives, would a commander typically have additional responsibilities?
Yes, just to maintain the scene and perimeter generally, because the BCA would not maintain a perimeter probably.
Sure. Would you be typically obligated to convey some information to the BCA upon their arrival?
Yes.
And what information may that be?
The layout of the crime scene, the location of the witnesses, the evidence, the location of the evidence.
And that role often falls on your shoulders, correct?
Correct.
And does that also require then, when you would come to a scene of a critical incident, that you basically have to figure out what happened or to understand what basically happened so that you can convey that information to the BCA?
Correct.
Now, in a critical incident, what is typically done with the officers involved in, let's say, the shooting, either as the shooter or a witness?
They are removed from the scene as quickly as possible, generally brought back to the police department with a partner officer.
Okay. sometimes referred to as a buddy officer or escort officer.
Correct.
If an involved officer used a firearm in an incident, is there anything typically done with the firearm?
Eventually, I would say the BCA would collect that firearm.
But the agency that typically would be collecting that would be the BCA, not your agency.
Correct.
Prior to April 11th, have you responded to other officer-involved shootings?
Yes.
Have you done so as a supervisor?
Yes.
And have you followed Brooklyn Center's policies and protocols in those past incidents?
Yes.
Okay. Now I want to talk about April 11th. Do you recall that day?
I do.
Were you working that day around 2 p.m.?
No, I was off, but on call.
Did you receive some information that prompted a response from you?
I received a significant page from dispatch that our agency was involved in an officer-involved shooting.
And do you recall when you received that information? 2:15, sometime around there?
Correct, around that time.
Okay. And the information that you received was that there was an officer-involved shooting in Brooklyn Center, correct? That information?
Correct.
Okay. What did you do in response to that specific information?
Contacted the duty sergeant, Sergeant Johnson.
Okay. Did Sergeant Johnson convey any additional information to you?
Yes. Gave me the involved officers, Officer Potter and Lucky, and I believe he also informed me that the victim was deceased.
Did he inform you that he was involved?
Eventually, I'm not sure if he initially told me.
Okay. After you received that information, what did you do?
Reported back to my residence and then went to the scene of the incident.
Okay. How long did it take you to get to the scene of the incident?
About 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay. As you drove to the scene, did you receive any additional updates?
I'm sure I did. I probably contacted the chief of police as well.
Okay. And the chief of the police at that time was Tim Gannon?
Yes.
As you were driving to the scene, what role did you anticipate playing in this case?
The scene commander in charge of the crime scene, and eventually to have to turn it over to the BCA.
Okay. You had mentioned an individual named Sergeant Johnson. Do you recall how long you've known Sergeant Johnson?
His entire career, which somewhere around 14 years, 12 to 14 years.
Okay. And is that in your capacity as supervising sergeants?
Yes.
Okay. And could you describe your relationship with him? Personal, professional?
Professional.
Professional. You had mentioned Officer Kim Potter. You'd agree she's in the courtroom today?
I do.
She's the defendant in this case?
Yes.
Can you describe the scope of your interactions with her?
Professional mostly. Was the union president, and I was the patrol commander, so we had a fair amount of interaction. We also go to the same gym, so we talk about gym and workouts.
Okay. Could you describe the type of communication you had with her in the role that she played?
As a union president,
Yes.
Labor management, negotiations.
I've ruled in this case her activities as a union representative is not relevant, so move on, counsel.
Needless to say, you had interactions with her beyond those of someone who supervises officers. There was a secondary relationship that you had with her professionally.
Correct.
Are you familiar with Officer Lucky?
Yes.
And am I understanding that he is a fairly new officer in your department?
In field training, yes.
Yep. On April 11th, he was in field training, but he's still an officer in your department, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now back to the incident. Do you recall when you arrived at the scene?
Around 2:38, 2:40, somewhere in there.
As you arrived, were you wearing a body-worn camera?
No.
At that time, did you know who was in charge of the scene in terms of what sergeants were present?
I knew Sergeant Peterson and Sergeant Johnson were there. I believed probably Sergeant Peterson was in charge.
And that's Sergeant Michael Peterson?
Yes.
Mike Peterson?
Yeah.
As you arrived, can you describe what you recall seeing at the scene?
I arrived on the eastern edge of the scene, which would be like 63rd and Catherine area. There was a crashed vehicle. There was 2 crashed vehicles actually, and I believe the deceased was on the northwest corner of that intersection.
Now, I'm only going to ask you a single question, and then I'm going to play a video. Do you recall that when you first entered the scene, you encountered an officer from the Brooklyn Center Police Department?
Yes.
And was that Officer Summers?
Yes.
Did you have a brief exchange with him?
Yes.
Okay. At this time, the state offers Exhibit 91.
Any objections in
Well,
91?
and number 1 is cumulative, and number 2 is not relevant to this offense.
The objection is overruled. I'll allow you to, 91 will be admitted and you may publish.
Thank you. Please play 91. Mr. Miller?
I'm always worried about all the traffic coming in from Brooklyn Park.
What's up?
We can handle some of the traffic on tonight. Like even down here.
They're way down there by
There's going to be heavy
the lights down, way down there. That's where the initial stop was, right by the school. Or
Like 63rd and Zane, or just down a couple more?
no, just right by the, is that the church or what is
I'll
that?
just shut it down at
Is Peterson down there?
at
I think so.
Is this a witness?
For the parents.
Okay.
Yeah.
You need witnesses?
So for
Just
everyone
the
on scene, we will keep
Well,
it shut down.
no, not that I know.
Areas are interpreter, but shut all traffic down.
for now.
And that's you.
Following the event captured in this video, do you agree that you then walked down and talked to those sergeants, Sergeant Peterson and Johnson?
Yes.
When you arrived, would you agree that you sort of took over command of the scene?
Yes.
Did you receive information about what occurred at the scene?
I did.
From whom did you obtain that information?
Sergeant Peterson and Sergeant Johnson a little bit.
What did you learn?
Objection to your hearsay.
The objection is sustained.
Sidebar.
Enough.